Path of Exile patch 3.17 is Siege of the Atlas. Cirrus and the Conquerors are dead. And to replace them, we have 4 brand new enemies with all new fights, a brand new Atlas, as well as many other new endgame changes. When it comes to choosing a League Start build, typically there are 3 camps that any given build falls into. A build that is focused on clear, a build that is focused on bossing, and one that is kind of a hybrid of the two. And the physical trap Saboteur finds itself very squarely in the bossing side of things. However, the clear of this build isn't anything to sneeze at, it simply just doesn't move fast enough to be considered a clear build. Now this build typically needs no introduction. You've seen this build in the Gauntlet, you've seen this build in Softcore, you've seen it pretty much everywhere for the last league or two. In the patch notes for 3.17, the only meaningful changes that this build has gotten is that Cluster, Multi, and Trap support are getting some nerfs. However, this only really affects Exsanguinate, which has gotten a sizable buff to make up for it. And Seismic Trap has gotten the same treatment that Toxic Rain got a few patches ago. However, this build was already extremely good even without scaling AoE, so the changes are negligible. With the defensive changes that we got in 3.16, there are enough defenses that pretty much any build in the game can adequately protect themselves, and this build is no different. In the initial version of this build, I have focused completely on making the build extremely durable, and we achieved this in a few ways. The build utilizes both evasion and armor to make sure that you don't get hit very often, and when you do get hit, you don't get hit very hard. On top of that, we reach 100% spell suppression to make sure that any spells that do make it through are going to only hit us for half damage, and the Saboteur has plenty of ways to recover our health bar extremely quickly, either through regeneration or through recovering life on traps triggering. We also do have an ascendancy point that is dedicated to blind, which is going to increase our chance to evade while also causing enemies to deal less damage to us while they are blinded. All of these things together provide an extremely tanky build. In the previous patch 3.16, the base level of this build with all of the defensives built in was able to handle up to 150 to 200 stacks of Scourge with little to no problems. Now just because this build is built for defensives doesn't mean that it does no damage. You might be worried about the changes that are happening to Seismic Trap, however, we're still hitting anywhere from 150 to 200,000 average hit per wave of each trap. With investments into increased duration, we're getting anywhere from 5 to 7 waves. That means you are doing in the realm of 1,000,000 damage per trap thrown to most endgame bosses. And that is with the defensive basic setup. An option that you do have with the physical trapper is that you can sacrifice some of these defensives to massively scale your damage. The main way that we do this is by investing into cluster jewels. As you invest more and more into damage, you can get close to 1,000,000 damage average hit. But do keep in mind, this will take significant investment and a lot of gear. So expect that in a League Start scenario, you will be hitting much closer to the 150 to 200,000. Now, all of this is assuming that you do not overlap the circles at all. So the changes that have been made should not affect the damage that I've stated here whatsoever. Another positive of this build is that it's actually possible to begin playing as the main abilities very early on in the game, as soon as level 28. You start this build as a Stormblast Mine and Orb of Storms, moving on to Lightning Trap, and then being able to swap into Exsanguinate and Seismic Trap at around 28. From that point on, you can scale all the way into the very end game content. So if you're looking for a durable build with solid recovery that should be able to easily take on all of the end game bosses in Siege of the Atlas, then the Physical Trapper might be the build for you. Talking a bit about the playstyle of this build, traps are a little bit different from maybe the standard ability. There is a bit of lag coming from when you actually use your skill and throw the trap on the ground and when the trap actually does its damage. This might feel slightly different to a standard build where you use your attack and you can immediately feel the damage that's happening. However, an added benefit of this is that you can preload your traps onto the ground as well for enemies that have like a loading phase or a boss that takes a little while to get going. So there's a bit of give and take in the playstyle of this build. What I would say is the only actual difficulty of this build is properly placing your seismic traps. Seismic traps tend to do damage in a circle around where they're placed. You do have to make sure that you are throwing your traps slightly to the side of the boss at any given time to make sure that you're going to be doing optimal damage. Something to keep in mind when it comes to builds, it comes to build guides, is that every one of these build guides is going to be like a recipe. You can change the recipe to fit whatever your needs are. I've done my best to make sure that this build has everything that you'll need to go from all the way at the start all the way to the end of the game. And as things get updated and we do get new information, I will do my best to update these path of buildings as well as the notes that is going to be down in the description of the video. So make sure that you go and check that out and come back every once in a while to see if there's been an update to the guide. Now the path of building should have everything that you need to have a successful league start. However, if you're more of a visual learner or you just prefer a video over a written guide, make sure that you check out the timestamps and chapters that are down below in this video. I've set it up so that maybe if you have a question later on, you can come back to the video, jump to that specific spot, and maybe get the answer that you're looking for. Now if my guides help you or enjoy my builds, make sure to like the video, and also if you want to stay up to date with all the latest content, make sure that you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you get notifications on all the latest videos. I will be making a ton of content in 3.17. I'll be making guides talking about all of the new bosses, as well as any new tips and tricks we get with the new Atlas that we're going to be getting, as well as the new Atlas skill tree that's going to be in the game. There's a lot of new things that are going to be happening in 3.17. If you want to check those things out a little bit earlier, I'm probably going to be live on twitch.tv/BigDucks, which you should go follow the way, pretty much every day for quite a while, so come hang out with your boy. The first thing that we're going to be starting out with here is the skills. If you want to see actual examples of these skills, make sure to jump to the gameplay example that's going to be a little bit later on in the video. Here we're going to be talking about the skills, what they do, and why we use the links that we use. Starting out from levels 1 to 11, we're using probably one of the most popular League start abilities in the game, which is going to be Stormblast Mine. Now I know you might not like this ability if it's something that you've used in the past, however it is just simply stronger in most cases than most other things available to us. Stormblast Mine is a mine ability that you have to place onto the ground and then detonate it with a separate ability. However, you can put the detonate mine ability onto your left click, which makes it so that as you throw them down and move around, those mines will explode. We link this with Swift Assembly to give us a chance to throw additional traps or mines, meaning that we're going to do more damage. And then we also link this with added lightning damage because we're hitting so frequently with it. Added lightning damage is very effective. Stormblast Mine also does have a good effectiveness of added damage. We're getting 110% effectiveness of the added lightning damage that we're putting. Alongside this, we'll be using Orb of Storms. This is an orb ability or a circle that you'll place onto the ground, and then when you stand inside of it and use another lightning ability, it will do procs of damage to anything that is nearby. You're going to continue using Orb of Storms all the way up to level 27 with Lightning Trap. However, we do link Onslaught and added lightning with this ability. Onslaught is going to make it so that if you drop this, say in the middle of a pack, it will allow you to keep the Onslaught buff on yourself, which will give you a little bit of speed. We also do once again use added lightning damage because this ability hits very frequently. At level 12, right as you enter Merveil's Cavern, you're going to get access to Lightning Trap. This ability is a slight upgrade over Stormblast Mine when it comes to play style, but it isn't necessarily a pure damage upgrade. It is about the same. However, it does allow you to start scaling trap nodes, so I do suggest that you change over to Lightning Trap. You will want to use the Pierce support with this as well, as the Lightning Trap projectiles that come out can travel quite far, so Pierce should be very good for clearing. You'll keep using these abilities, Orb of Storms as well as Lightning Trap, all the way until you hit level 28 and gain access to Seismic Trap. I do suggest that you go and grab the Exsanguinate gem as soon as you're able to and start leveling it, maybe in another slot or maybe in an offhand, something like that. Because around the time that you do make it to level 28, you can swap over to both of these abilities. These will be the main abilities that you're going to be using for the rest of the game. Exsanguinate is a very solid ability for clearing, especially when you're able to use the chain gem. It makes it so that when you drop the Exsanguinate traps on the ground, the ability chains to a bunch of different enemies nearby, and sometimes you can get entire screens cleared with just a few traps thrown. Now I do want to make mention that early on you will need to use the trap support gem. However, when you do get a pair of Deer Stalkers, which should be relatively cheap, that provide that link to any gems that are slotted into those boots, you can swap out the trap support for charge traps, which will start proccing you frenzy, power charges, and make your life a lot more simple. Also, while leveling, you are able to use a few auras. I suggest that you use Skitterbots simply because it's very good for damage. Grace is going to be your main defensive aura, and you can use War Banner for a little bit of extra damage. If you like, you can swap the Defiance Banner later on if you just want more defensives instead of damage, but I do feel that while leveling, the build is relatively tanky and you really don't need it. For movement skills and for utility skills, I prefer Flame Dash, as it is a instant ability if you only use it every once in a while. We link this with Life Tap, and we also use Bear Trap. On difficult mobs, throw a Bear Trap as well as the rest of your traps to make sure that they take additional damage. Now when it comes to our main ability, Seismic Trap, the main links that we're using are going to be Life Tap so that we can use as much of our mana for auras as possible. We're going to be using Advanced Traps, which makes it so that we can throw more of these Seismic Traps out more often. We're using Trap and Mine Damage, which you can swap out for Charge Traps if you like, if you want to be able to throw more traps more quickly. Trap and Mine Damage is going to allow you to maximize a bit more damage out of each individual trap, because Seismic Trap is a cooldown based trap, which means you have a limited amount of them at any given time. So you want to squeeze out the most damage that you can out of each individual trap you throw. Brutality is a very solid damage link, but it does prevent you from doing any kinds of elemental or chaos damage. So if early on in the game you're using Seismic Trap and you happen to have like a really big added damage wand or something, hold off on Brutality until it is an upgrade. The final link that you'll use is Increased Critical Strikes, because this build does scale quite a bit of crit multi very easily. Increased Crit Strikes will get you that higher crit chance, which should increase your damage substantially. In the crit and cluster section here, a few of the gems have changed simply because we're going to be moving over to a more crit focused setup with the cluster jewels. The only real difference here is that we're going to be using crit damage as well. For the auras in the endgame, we're still using Summon Skitterbots because this is is a very, very powerful aura. It provides us shock, it provides us chill, and it provides us extra damage with our traps. We're going to be using Grace as one of our defensive layers, as well as Defiance Banner and Determination. This build scales a lot of evasion and armor to give us our base defensive layer, and we mainly get this through auras and aura effectiveness. Now, at the time of this recording, the Blessing has not been added, but I will update the path of building whenever I do have the option. There is going to be a new Blessing support that will give you a temporary aura for a certain amount of time. This might be something that could be used very well with Pride for bosses. Historically, what I had done is I would temporarily turn the Determination aura off on bosses that I was comfortable with and swap it over to Pride to get the more damage modifier out of that. Another option that you do have is you can use War Banner instead of Defiance Banner if you're looking for a little bit more damage. The Defiance Banner is probably better for staying alive, as this build does quite a bit of damage. Now, one of the major changes that has happened with the in-game setup of this build is that Exsanguinate is now going to be linked to Swift Assembly. I feel that you might still be able to use Cluster Traps if your damage is high enough, but there's going to be a significant less damage modifier now on Cluster Traps as well as Multi-Trap, so do keep that in mind. You can switch between these as you like and see what feels better to you. It may not be cut and dry. I'm not 100% certain on this because I haven't been able to test it in the new league yet, but either or should be fine. Figure out what feels best for you. The other links are going to be Chain as well as Charge Trap. We have these in a pair of trap gloves. Until then, you will still need to use the previous links that's shown up here, but as soon as you are able to get those trap gloves or the Deer Stalkers, if you're very early on in the league, you will want to use the trap link. However, Chain is going to increase our clear substantially, and Charge Traps is going to be our main source of frenzy and power charges. These will affect all of the rest of the abilities in our kit as well. For movement, we are still going to be using Flame Dash and Bear Trap to do additional damage to enemies. For our curse, we're going to be using Assassin's Mark. Now, potentially you might not need to use an Arcanist brand anymore, as Assassin's Marks are going to be permanent going forward, but this is something that I'm going to have to experiment with in the new league, so I will update this and change it if something does change or I find something better. However, the Arcanist brand will still work perfectly fine. We're going to be using Molten Shell on our left click for extra defenses, as well as Vol Molten Shell as just an extra special buff in case you get into a rough scenario. Siphoning Trap will also be an additional set of healing that you can get. It's extremely powerful if you remember to throw them during boss encounters. It can keep you healed up pretty well. No, I'm not exactly suggesting the Cold Tree or the Cold Conversion version that often anymore. The main reason that you would want to use this is that if you were pushing really, really hard early on in the league, and say Cold Iron points are very expensive, or maybe you're in like Solo Self-Found and you want something that'll do a little bit more damage very early on. However, it is better to just stay with the standard Phys Trapper, especially if Cold Iron points aren't too expensive. Now, talking about the items and how you're going to attempt to gear when it comes to this build, you're going to start out with just some very, very simple wands. These are just +1 to level of physical spell gem wands. Now, there is a recipe to be able to craft these if you aren't able to get a hold of them, say in a trade league environment or something, and that is going to be listed in the notes. There is a crafting section there. They're quite easy to make. The rest of your gear, you're just going to be looking for evasion, life, resistances, as well as spell suppression. Our goal is to hit 100% spell suppression so that you are going to only be taking half of any spell damage for your character. The one unique that we're looking out for early on is a very common unique. It is Deer Stalker boots. These are going to give you significant movement speed, some trap throwing speed, life, as well as socketed gems are supported by a level 11 trap. This is going to make it so that you can have that easy 5-link Exsanguinate early on until you can swap over into a pair of trap gloves later in the build. For amulet and jewelry, we're just looking for crit multi if you can manage it, and stats, resists, and life. That is the main thing that you're looking for in most of the rares on the build. We're going to be using a variety of flasks. This build is naturally immune to ignite as well as shock, so you don't need to worry about getting those covered. You are going to be using Soul of the Brine King with the upgrade that makes it so that you cannot be frozen, so that's not important either. However, I would say that on the Quicksilver Flask, you still want the immunity to chill on the Quicksilver Flask. If you can handle being chilled, then don't use this because it significantly reduces the duration of your flasks. However, I found it to be perfectly fine. We're also using a Diamond Flask because crit is so powerful. This is a very special flask in that it uses a enchantment that gives you increased effect of the flask, but gains no charges during the flask effect. I suggest that you use this specifically for difficult monsters and bosses. I personally think the Panicked line of flasks is one of the more powerful life flasks in the game. It makes it so that when you are on low life, which means under half of your health, you're going to get an instant recovery of a big boost of life. We also roll Bleed and Corrupting Blood immunity on this one. It makes it significantly easier to deal with those things if you can just tap this flask whenever you see those, and then you're immune to it for a very long time. And then we use a Jade Flask as well as a Granite Flask to give us some extra boosts to evasion and armor. armor. As I said, those are some of the main defensive layers of the build. With these on, you'll see that our evasion rating is about 18,000, our armor is 6,500. With these two flasks on, those get boosted up significantly to almost 30,000 and almost 15,000. It's going to make us significantly more tanky. The vast majority of our jewels are just going to be simple life and crit multi-jewels. You can also use physical damage jewels if you like. Those might be easier to come by very early on. Anything with life and any amount of damage will be good. This is the first set of gear that you're going to be striving to get very, very early in the league. As soon as you are a little bit further in, maybe you're in some high tier maps, you've got a bit of money to spend, we're going to be moving over into the mid tier of gear. The first things that you should be going for, in my opinion, are going to be a Tinker Skin and Cold Iron Points. These are very, very important to the build, Tinker Skin particularly, because what this does is it once again gives us another source of frenzy charges, it gives us a source of phasing, but it also gives us our life and energy shield recovery when enemies are triggering a trap. And we get some of this from a mastery early on that gives you 30 life, but this is going to be the main source of it for later on. This is going to be the thing that keeps you alive during boss fights, so I do heavily suggest that you invest into this. Now when we're looking at damage, Cold Iron Points are easily the king of damage. These are the items that when you want to do more damage, this is what you invest into. In Scourge League, these were close to an Exalt very early on in the league because the build was so popular, so beware that they may not be cheap early on. It very much depends on the economy, how popular this build is in comparison to other ones, as well as anything else. Like even this guide is going to affect how popular and how expensive these items are. You do not need them, but they are a big boost in damage. You can get these through chance orbs. Very, very unlikely that you do that unless you're like me and I chanced one of them on my very first chance orb in Scourge League. Streamer RNG, by the way. And you can also get these through Expedition. They're relatively likely through Expedition, so that may be something that you want to do to be able to get this item if you can't afford it early on. Beyond that, we have Crown of the Inward Eye. This is going to give us Transfiguration of Soul, Body, and Mind, meaning we can convert some of our defensive layers into offensive layers. This helmet also has significant energy shield and armor and percentages to life, mana, and global energy shield. It is just an all-around very solid offensive and defensive helmet. Now this is an item that drops off of Cirrus, so keep in mind that this may be a little bit harder to come by this league simply because Cirrus is side content now and he's always going to be difficult. You're not going to be able to farm like early Cirrus or anything like that, so do keep in mind I'm not positive on the cost of this item, maybe more or less expensive. This is going to be a pair of Shaper Gloves with socketed gems are supported by Trap. This is one of the more important items on the build as well, but not as important to get first. I feel that this should be one of the later upgrades that you make, unless you happen to be able to find a pair that are very cheap. This enables you to take off the Deerstalker boots and move over to either at Ziri's Step or a good pair of rare boots, so I do suggest that when you can get these, go for them. You can make these yourself if you can get a pair of Shaper Gloves, and you can just use essences or anything else to try to craft one of these yourself. Relatively common to get the trap node. You're just looking for trap as well as some life or something like that. Now after you have gotten those trap gloves, you can swap into at Ziri's Step boots. The big thing about at Ziri's Step is that it gives you a significant amount of movement speed, a good amount of evasion, and the chance to suppress spell damage. These were a little expensive early on in this league, but they probably won't be insanely expensive and you should be able to afford them pretty easily. These are just a very, very solid pair of boots. They can easily be replaced by a very good rare pair though, with better resistances, good movement speed, as well as chance to suppress spell damage. In the mid tier, you might be able to find a +1 amulet early on because of the change to the way that amulets are made now. However, I don't exactly know how rare those are going to be, so I'm going to just leave the budget amulet in here for now. Onto the rings, we're looking for a little bit more life, stats, and resistances out of our rings now, as well as the belt. We're looking to get more resistances, more life out of it. The flasks are staying about the same, nothing really has changed there, as well as the jewels. Now moving on into the expensive tier of gear, the main things that are changing here is that we're trying to get a +1/+1 amulet. Now this may be more or less difficult depending on, you know, the price of certain harvest crafts and such. I have changed the notes to show you how to craft an amulet like this. You can also go look for the video that Path of Math made that explains how to craft some of these amulets. You might be able to get a +1 to level of all gems and physical gems amulet instead of all dexterity gems, so that would help out both of your abilities, but you'll have to see how things are going in the middle of the league. We also are going to be using a vulnerability on hit ring saying. This does work with traps. It is confirmed. Unless they change something in this patch, I've used it myself and it works quite well. Now, this isn't the most insane set of gear that you possibly could have because this is meant to be a league start guide. It's meant to get you pretty decently far into the game. You should be able to do most of the content with the items that I've shown here. The vast majority of the cost that can go into this build when we're talking about actual gear is really going to be when we start talking about the cluster jewels. I'll talk about the cluster jewels and other things in a different part of the video. The next thing we're going to talk about is the leveling trees, why we choose the skills that we choose, where we're moving around the leveling trees, as well as how to do some of the transitions that happen towards the middle of the game. So starting out from levels 1 to 26 is pretty straightforward. We're mainly going to be moving up through damage, elemental damage, life, some trap damage and crit here, as well as these trap nodes here. This is expeditious munitions, which means that it's going to increase our trap throwing speed, which is going to make it significantly easier to move around, throw traps down on the ground, and we are going to take our recover 30 life when a trap is triggered by an enemy. This is insanely powerful while leveling. Don't underestimate this. This can make it so that you feel like an absolute god while leveling if you do it properly. Every single time a trap is triggered, meaning any single trap, you're getting 30 life back. Very early on in the game, you've only got a couple hundred life, maybe 1,000 at most, and you can throw out like 5 to 10 traps in a second or two, so this is a significant amount of life. Then we're moving north on the tree, grabbing these life and energy shield nodes, as well as moving up towards hasty reconstruction. This is going to make it so that our seismic trap has an additional use, as well as reducing the cooldown rate for seismic trap. These nodes are going to make it so that we can throw significantly more seismic trap, and this is going to give us a little bit more mana to reserve because our summon skitterbots has increased mana reservation efficiency. We are also going to be able to do our first ascendancy at around this time. It might take you a little bit longer, but I do suggest that you go Pyromaniac, as this will help you deal with the life cost that Exsanguinate is going to have. When you make the transition over into Exsanguinate and Seismic Trap, you're going to be mainly casting them off of your life. So having Pyromaniac as well as the gain 30 life every time a trap is triggered will make it so that you don't have to worry about, not having enough life to live and throw your abilities. The next tree that we're going to be doing is going to take us to level 37. We're mainly going to be grabbing a bunch of damage nodes here, meaning we're going to be getting Clever Construction, a chance for those big seismic traps to trigger again, as well as a little bit of area effect and trap damage, and the ability to place more traps at one time. What this is going to do for you is it's going to make it so that when you are fighting a boss, maybe one that loads in and takes a couple of seconds, you can toss a whole bunch of traps on the ground and just insta-give them as soon as they spawn. We're also going to be moving over here, grabbing these Chaos Resistance as well as a All Resistance and Chaos Resistance node. Chaos Resistance comes at a premium most of the time, and this should be pretty solid for any poisons that your character will take, as well as any chaos damage early on in the game. The next section is going to be moving over into level 54. We're going to be moving down, grabbing these life nodes here, as well as the 50 life mastery. The main reason that we take this is simply for the life percentage itself. Recover life on kill does not work with traps unless you are using an ailment or like a damage over time effect. The limitation of the engine, don't think about it too much. We're also moving up into here to grab this physical damage and as well as the strength. We do use skills that cost mainly life, so this node, this mastery, will cause us to do significantly more damage. We're moving over into these evasion, spell suppression, and life nodes. We're taking the Grace Mastery, and around this time you can start using the Grace Aura, start leveling it up, and you should feel significantly tankier with it on. We're going to move into these trap nodes, just going to give us a little bit of damage and throw speed, as well as our first source of gaining frenzy charges very easily, and a couple additional traps on the ground. On top of that, we're able to take our second ascendancy point, which is going to be Perfect Crime. This gives us three very, very important things: increased damage for each trap that we have out, a chance for our traps to trigger again, so this is just a chance for each of those huge damage seismic traps to just spawn again. This is also going to give us reduced costs of throwing those traps, so our life total is not going to be as harmed so frequently with the big cost of all of the traps. And then the next section that we're going to be moving to is going towards level 67. We're going to be moving towards the middle of the tree, moving over towards these life, as well as some life gained on kill. Once again, the life gained on kill does not work for us because we're not actually getting the kill, the traps are getting the kill. We're also going to be grabbing these evasion and spell suppression nodes, the increased evasion rating for your body armor, moving over towards Mage Bane, which is going to make it so that we convert our dexterity into spell suppression, which is really powerful. Some more life and nodes here, and then we're going to be getting some of our first skill effect duration nodes. What these do is it makes it so that when you throw a seismic trap out, seismic trap pulses every so often, and if you increase the skill effect duration of seismic trap, it increases how long it will continue to pulse for. Skill effect duration will make it go from us only pulsing maybe 4 times all the way up to potentially 7. Same thing with the mastery here, more skill effect duration, and then we get a little bit of resistances and evasion rating and armor on this part of the tree. We're also going to be able to get our third ascendancy point, which is chain reaction. This gives us significant cooldown recovery for our seismic traps. It does give us some AoE scaling, but this isn't super effective anymore, and it does make it so that when your traps trigger, your nearby traps also trigger. So if you throw out a bunch of traps down, now you don't have to worry about some of them missing those triggers. Now moving on to the next tree, we're going to be moving into level 73. Now you might notice that we are connecting a different portion of the tree here. This is because we're preparing to do a respec. At around the time that you're ending the game, these nodes are no longer really that useful for you, as well as some of these nodes up here, so we're needing to move those points elsewhere. You should have a decent amount of respec points as well as a couple regret orbs by the time that you start entering maps. So what we do is we connect these portions of the tree, and then in our next respec, you'll notice that we take out these points, and we're moving them down towards this section of the tree. So what we've obtained here are these aura nodes. These are going to allow us to use all of the auras that we want to. The reservation mastery is going to be mana reservation efficiency of skills. We're moving down into this section of the tree, grabbing these life and flask nodes, as well as these suppression, evasion, and movement speed nodes here to cap out our suppression. The next step is going to be filling in the rest of our suppression. We're moving into here to grab this spell suppression, as well as the critical strike chances increased by chance to suppress spell damage. We do have a 100% chance to suppress now, even with just some basic gear. If I move into the budget Phys gear, we are still at 100% chance to suppress. So at this point, you have mostly completed your tree. When we're moving into the physical tree, you'll notice a couple small things change. You can choose for yourself when you want to put in some of these points, as the main difference is we're going for these jewel slots. So as you get access to more of these jewels early on in the game, you can fill in these slots with jewels. So now that we've gone through the entire skill tree, the next thing I want to talk about is how we're going to be making the transitions into cluster jewels when you want to start scaling a little bit more damage for the build. Because at this point, if you've made it all the way to here, you are quite tanky. However, you're going to have some issues with damage significantly later on. I personally feel that in Path of Exile, for certain bosses, it is much better to have very high damage than to be very durable. So if you feel that you just can't really get those bosses down and you're looking for some way to be able to fight them a little bit better, more damage is typically the answer. The way that I look at it is that it's very important for a build to be durable while you're mapping and moving around and such, but once you get to that point where you're really trying to take down bosses, if you make it so that you have to spend less time on the boss itself, that gives you less chances to mess up. More damage means less time spent on the boss. Now, the first change that we're going to make is going to be to this cluster jewel tree. Now, you can use this compare function to see what these differences are. The main thing is that we're going to be moving out of these chaos resistance nodes. We're going to be moving a couple nodes around here, dropping some of these masteries as well as some of these resists and these jewels here, and moving most of those into an actual cluster jewel. Now, the reason why cluster jewels are so powerful is because they pack a lot of specific damage nodes into a very small amount of space. So if you look into here, you'll notice a huge amount of physical damage. Reduced elemental damage doesn't matter. We're using cold iron points and brutality. We don't do elemental damage anyways. This also gains us some resistances, a bunch of evasion and armor and physical damage, as well as chance to deal double damage, increased physical damage. This cluster jewel is not as difficult to craft as you might think it is. You can craft physical cluster jewels significantly easier than you think. The hard part is actually getting the base. However, you can use like a 9 or 10 passive base. Those are significantly cheaper. As for the medium, this early on, it's probably not worth going for crit clusters yet, so we're going to be using a trap cluster. You can see this gives us a bunch of damage, a bunch of throw speed, movement speed if you've thrown a trapper mine recently, and then we've got a bunch of damage, a bunch of life, a bunch of mana. And once again, we're just using some simple physical damage, life, crit type jewels. Now, with this setup, we still have maintained all of our spell suppression and a lot of our defenses. I do feel that the ideal balance of like damage and survivability is on this tree. I do feel that this is the best one out of most of them. However, if you're really wanting to do like some very high level content, talking like big invitations, and you really want stuff that's going to do a ton of damage, you can move over to a second cluster jewel tree, and I'll show you the differences here. As you can see, We've cut off a lot of our defenses here. This whole section is gone. We've dropped off this whole section down here at the bottom. We've dropped these physical nodes and we've moved them all up here into the top. So if we look at this tree, the main things that we're gaining here is that we're gaining some aura effectiveness. This is just really powerful for the build, especially when we start scaling those higher level auras, and we're moving into a second set of cluster jewels. Now you might also notice that there is another cluster jewel down here, another medium. These are crit clusters now. We're trying to scale crit chance and crit multiplier. If you see the chance over here on the side, that is with the budget items. On the mid-tier items, it's going even higher. 95% crit chance, 435% multiplier, and if we move into the expensive items, we're getting even more damage here. And on top of that, if you start using the proper auras and such for damage specifically, if we take off, say, Determination and Defiance banner and turn on Pride and War banner, close to 1,000,000 damage average hit on Cirrus level monsters, meaning we're getting like 4 to 5 times that per trap thrown. So it is a significant amount of damage. However, I'm not going to be activating these because we want to be a tanky boy, and we'll move back to the budget set of gear as well. Now, we're going to start using crit clusters. These are going to give us damage, crit chance, some crit multi maybe as well if you can wing it. It really depends on what you're able to afford with these crit clusters. And also up here, you'll notice that we're using another one of these physical gems with the very, very good nodes, and then Basics of Pain, as well as Pressure Point. We've got a bunch of chance to deal double damage, as well as a bunch of critical strike chance. Then this also allows us to use a bunch of these life and crit multi-jewels. We're up to 435% crit multi, which is really, really powerful. We have also swapped over to using Eldritch Battery at this point instead of life. If you noticed, in the Seismic trap for the crit and clusters, there is no life tap here. There's nothing that's going to make you cost life. So we're going to start using our energy shield to cast those abilities. Also, you might have noticed to save a couple of points, we are using Thread of Hope. The Thread of Hope allows us to save a couple of points here and there. It allows us to get things like Expeditious Munitions, Clever Construction, Assassination, Saboteur. It allows us to get these things without wasting a whole bunch of travel points, which lets us put more points into cluster jewels, thus becoming pretty powerful. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is this Ghost Dance. You can take this pretty much whenever you want. It just makes it so that this will keep your energy shield up pretty well if you are, getting hit early on before you go Eldritch Battery. You can also use this as just a pretty solid defensive layer. We have a ton of evasion, so 3% of your evasion whenever you lose a Ghost Shroud, it's pretty good. I do want to quickly talk about the configuration for those people that claim, oh, he's just PoB warrioring. This is the configuration that you should see. This is an enemy hit damage of 3,500. That is the rough amount of damage that a high tier map enemy should be hitting you at any given time. You can move this all the way up to 7,000 if you want. That's about the average hit of like an in-game boss if they're actually meleeing you. So we'll leave it at in-game boss. Most of the time I'm going to say 3,500, but for right now, for these demonstrations, we'll leave it at about 7,000. Power charges and frenzy charges are gained through charge traps, which is on our Exsanguinate. We have life tap because we're using life tap on a bunch of our abilities. We throw tons of traps out. We'll easily have more than 10 traps triggered. We're always throwing traps. The enemy is blinded because of our ascendancy. This makes it so that anything that we hit is blinded. This is on Cirrus, and there's nothing else activated anywhere else in here. Now, for those of you that prefer a little bit more of a visual explanation of a few things, I want to give you an idea of how you're meant to use these traps. Now, this is the same gear that you saw in those videos early on where I was just doing some random mapping. This is the same exact character, same exact gear. This was my Scourge character. There's nothing crazy about any of the gear that we're using here. All of the items are very, very basic. I don't even have a +1/+1 amulet, or even a +1 amulet for that matter of fact. No crazy items, no crazy gear. I have one set of cluster jewels. As I said previously, it's just a simple single set of cluster jewels. I'm using the normal Phys tree from before. I haven't leveled up exactly enough, so it is slightly different, but you can see there's nothing crazy about any of this gear. Now, as I said previously, we are going to be using a Swift Assembly support instead of multi-traps now. With Swift Assembly, you're just going to randomly throw a bunch of traps occasionally. With multi-trap, when you put in multi-trap, you'll notice that it throws a bunch of traps at one time. Now, you can use multi-trap, you can use cluster trap, whichever one that you prefer. It really depends on what you like to do. But do keep in mind that multi-trap, as well as trap support and cluster trap support, are all getting significant nerfs. So it might be better to do one or the other. You can try between those. Now, I did do some testing with a low-level Exsanguinate, even just to, assume all of the nerfs, but Exsanguinate itself is getting a pretty sizable buff that we know now, so there really shouldn't be too much of a change if you're using Swift Assembly. However, I did some testing with like a level 14 Exsanguinate, and I was still able to clear very high tier maps. So now when I'm talking about the issues that you might have with Seismic Trap and targeting a boss, if we imagine that, say, Helena is the boss that we're going to be attacking, right? Typically when you're using abilities, you just throw them right on top of the boss, and you want them to just hit right where it's at. So for Exsanguinate and other normal abilities, that works perfectly fine. However, you might notice that if you throw Seismic Trap directly on top of an enemy, when it procs, it's not exactly going to be hitting exactly where you want. Do you notice how sometimes in the middle there, she's not actually getting hit by the ability? Because some of the circles are spread out. This is going to be even more so the case in the next patch, where area is going to scale how far apart these explosions happen. So what you want to do is you want to target your Seismic Trap slightly to the side of the enemy. So if I place the Seismic Trap here, when it spawns, it should guarantee most of the time that she is being hit. You see how she's being hit much more reliably now, and sometimes it's overlapping 2 or 3? This can make a significant difference in damage. If you feel like you're having issues with damage and you're throwing all of your traps right on top of the boss or top of the enemy that you're trying to do, most of them are going to miss. And if it's a very small boss, you can see like almost none of those are hitting her, right? However, if you try to do the same thing, and we throw a whole bunch of traps a little bit away from her, when those proc, you're going to see a ton of them overlap on top of her. You notice that she's getting hit by almost all of them, right? Now, if you were scaling significant AoE previously, you could do this a little bit differently, but with the new way that AoE is scaling, it is not the way to go. You want to throw the traps slightly to the side. Now beyond that, we do have a few other abilities. As I said, we've got Molten Shell that's going to be on left click. Bear Trap should be thrown on bosses just to give you a little bit of extra damage. We can do Flame Dash for our movement, as well as an Arcanist Brand whenever we're fighting a difficult enemy. Now, we're just going to do a random map here. We'll just go grab a random tier 15, something like, I don't know, do we have anything good in here? Let's do a cemetery. So we'll do a cemetery map. This is a Valdo's map. We're just going to alch it, go with whatever it is. Okay, so this is unique boss has more life, elemental weakness, frenzy charge and hit, and less recovery rate of life and energy shield. This means that we're going to heal significantly less than we normally would. There's nothing crazy on this. This is a tier 15 map, Awakener 8. I'm not adding anything special, all the same gear. With the changes that are happening, Exsanguinate should still be perfectly fine. It's getting a big base boost to its damage, and it is also going to be losing a little bit of the damage from the support gem, so it should be pretty much a wash. Shouldn't be a significant change on this. But as you can see, for the most part, we're perfectly fine on most enemies. For a rare, you toss down a Seismic Trap, shouldn't be too big of a deal. Now, this build has not changed defensively in any way. I have changed up a few of the auras that you can use if you'd like, as once again, for more difficult monsters, you can throw down a Seismic if you like, but this build has been a powerhouse for a long time. The damage is very substantial. I would say that you're probably going to want to use a few more Seismic Traps weaved in now. We can still try multi-trap, but I don't 100% know. Give multi-trap, give cluster trap a try for yourself when you get into the league. You can just swap those gems out pretty much whenever you want to see what feels better for you. But as you can see, build is relatively tanky. We can even go into the Scourgeverse. I don't even have my auras on. Oh, there you go. So even with having that many mobs just randomly hitting me for, I don't know, 2 or 3 seconds while I was putting my auras on, still mostly fine. I almost, I took a lot of damage there while I was putting my auras on, but as you can see, the build is relatively tanky, doesn't take too much damage, everything is mostly good. Now, when it comes to bossing, the damage should still be about the same as it was last league. If you were doing Area of Effect Abuse, then yeah, you're not going to do as much damage, but toss down your extra abilities, toss down some Seismic Traps, and just wait for the damage to happen. And when the Seismic Traps go out, the boss should take quite a bit of damage. Pretty much all there is to it. Once again, Awakener 8, the same exact gear that I had on before, nothing has changed, and, is what it is. This isn't crazy gear. This isn't a crazy tree with a bunch of jewels or a bunch of crazy stuff. My jewels are just normal Phys damage life jewels. There's nothing insane here or anything like that. Just very basic gear that a somewhat decent player can get in the first few weeks. And that is going to be it for the video. Now, if you have further questions on anything that's going on, make sure that you reference this video. Make sure that you go check the notes in the Path of Building. I'm going to update the Path of Buildings as often as I can with relevant information as we find it throughout the league. So make sure to check those places first. You can check the comment section down below of the YouTube video to see what other people are saying, or maybe they figured out something that I haven't. Other than that, you can go and join my Discord. Now keep in mind, the people there are not meant to be helping you, but there may be some helpful souls there that can answer a question or two if I'm not available or I'm not over at my Twitch stream at twitch.tv/bigducks, which you should go follow, by the way. I hope that you guys enjoy the build. If this video has helped you out, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and make sure to hit that notification bell for updates on all the latest content. Stay safe out there in Ray class, and I will see you guys in 3.17 Siege of the Atlas.